Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. Certainly we hear that we're losing our World War II veterans, 1,000 a day they say, but there are many who treat their senior years like prime years. And one of those is R.F. Sonny Franze of Bryan. A native of the farm that he grew up on near Kurten, today Sonny Franze remains active, whether it's tending to his extensive collection of barbed wire, guns, or nutcrackers, or just telling the remarkable story of leaving the farm and going into the Army, learning to climb telephone poles and set communication wire, and eventually taking that training across the North Atlantic to the front lines of Europe, landing at Normandy on D+10. The bravery that led to 5 Bronze Stars and the horror his unit discovered at the concentration camp called Buchenwald. Sonny Franze, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
A young kid growing up on the farm near Kurten, and all of a sudden they yank you off the farm and they put you in the Army. That had to be quite a culture shock, I would think.
Well, it really was. I was literally drafted out of the cotton patch in September of 1942. I never traveled much, but that soon changed with my first trip to Houston for my physical and to be inducted into the service, then back to Bryan, and 2 weeks later on a bus to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, there to get all of my clothing, all of my GI shoes and clothing and blankets and everything else you need, discard everything that was civilian. And they immediately tried to make a soldier out of a plowhand, and they didn't have much time to do it. So they taught us right away how to make our beds, how to roll your socks and all that stuff, which they lasted about a week, I guess. And then they said, pack all your things in your barracks bag and be out in the street in 10 minutes. Be ready to leave.
Yeah, your traveling days were just beginning, because you weren't in San Antonio very long, and you were off to Salt Lake City, right?
Right. Get out there in the street in 10 minutes, and so we sat on our bags for 2 hours before the buses came and took us to the train station, and then our first stop was Salt Lake City.
You didn't know at this time, you still didn't know what your job in the Army was going to be, and when you got to Salt Lake City, you said they dropped you off at a hangar, and you were afraid that you were about to find out what your job was going to be, right?
That's right. They dropped us off in a hangar, and with the different parts of the diagrams of the planes shown around, and I thought sure I was probably going to be a tail gunner or something, but I still had no idea what I was going to be doing in the service.
Then it was off to Spokane, Washington for real basic training.
Right. That was the next stop, Spokane, Washington, and there we started our basic training in earnest. And we marched and we marched and we marched. We wasn't marching with peeling potatoes or attending shows that showed how discipline was so important, and insubordination was certainly not tolerated.
Right.
They made us believe that during time of war you could face a firing squad for most anything, and that made a soldier out of you right quick.
I imagine it did. Yeah. And then eventually you went to Reno, Nevada,
right.
And I guess it was there that you found out what your Army career was going to be. Talk about that.
That is correct. After our basic training in Spokane, we went to Reno, Nevada, just outside of Reno at Lemon Valley. And there I found out that I was going to be in the signal or communications, and I was going to be a pole lineman. They sent me out with a pair of spurs to learn to climb poles. Well, I'd always been a climber. I'd climbed everything from little on, mostly trees to shake out a possum, but
telephone pole was a different thing.
This was different, especially with the old dull spurs they gave us, but I managed to be able to climb pretty good. And of course, seeing Reno was really something to this old country boy, you know,
with all the kid.
With all the silver dollars lined up on the tables. That was really something. and to go to a bar and fellows with me ordered a highball. I didn't know what that was, but I said, I'll have one of those. I thought that was the best tasting whiskey I ever had.
Better than that bootleg stuff you had at home.
Yeah. And of course, we continued our training there. There's a little humor with it too. One morning we was in formation, and just before we were dismissed, the sergeant said, "Need some volunteers." So I volunteered, which you're not supposed to do in the Army, but I, along with half a dozen or so others, volunteered, and he said, "All the rest of you can go back to your bunks. And those that volunteers can go out in the sagebrush there and chase jackrabbits." There's plenty of rabbits around. We saw one, but we didn't chase him very far.
That was the end of your volunteer days, right?
Right.
You learned to keep your mouth shut then.
Well, from Reno, then we went to, it was traveling again to Fresno, California, which was supposed to be our battalion headquarters.
Right.
But communications consisted of so many different things. Pole linemen, or whether it was cable or cable splicing or field wire or whatever. So we splintered our outfit and sent us off in different directions for this training. And mine was to go all the way back to Everett, Washington, and learn pole line construction.
You told me one time during this training that there was an incident that your career in life almost ended. It was a little scary.
Well, that's true. I was working on this telephone line. These poles had the power line on at the top of the pole, and below were telephone cross arms. And I was up on the pole guiding the wire across the cross arm that the truck was pulling a wire across. When the wire broke and the end of it flew up over the power line and came right back down on and got against my metal on my spur, on the shank of the spur. And the sparks were flying out of that, and I thought sure I was going to get electrocuted, but this foreman on the civilian foreman, he said, "Just stay calm and reach down with your glove and take that wire off your spur," which I did, and strangely I never felt a shock of any kind.
Very fortunate.
Yeah.
Eventually to Seattle, and finally you got off the West Coast, and you moved closer to where you were going because you went cross country to Newport News, Virginia, to get ready to go to Europe. Let's go ahead and fast forward there. You're at Newport News, and eventually you're on the boat across the North Atlantic, and that, you recall, is a pretty miserable trip.
Oh, that was terrible. We were on a ship named Santa Paula. It was a converted small ocean liner, and we had 3,200 personnel on board, but only 1,600 bunks. So we were supposed to have a bed every other night, and we sailed up the coast to St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland, and there we anchored for 24 hours because there was a pack of submarines, German subs, reported off the coast, and finally got our convoy together, which consisted of two troop transports, two tankers, and we were escorted by two destroyers. We started out, and the sea immediately got so rough in the North Atlantic, it was terrible. It got into a storm, and the waves were 50 feet high, I guess. And the guy that I was supposed to bunk with got so seasick he couldn't get out of bed.
So you gave up your bed.
I just took my blankets and went out on the deck, where I stayed in this miserable weather, and I never did get sick, but I sure was cold.
That was a long 2 weeks, but eventually you landed in Liverpool,
Yeah.
And going to England, that was a little bit of a culture shock for the farm boy too, landing in England, right?
It was too. I thought the British spoke English, but I couldn't. Where I was,
Wasn't South Texas English.
I could hardly understand them. And then, of course, we got paid with their English money, which was a farthing, and a halfpenny, and a penny, and a shilling, which they called a bob, and we had to get used to all that.
You're getting ready for in the spring of 1944 is where we are now. You were sent to an RAF base where you said that you learned a little bit about doing without food.
Yeah, we were just a small group of us were in training and sent to stay on the RAF base. Mm-hmm. And there, of course, we had to eat with the British soldiers on our base. And they didn't have much food. They had a lot of potatoes, which they fixed for one meal, maybe three different kinds of, 3 different ways, with some mutton that tasted terrible, but you had to eat it because it's all you had. And the British didn't have any money, the British soldiers.
Right.
And we always had some. We could buy a little extra stuff that we needed, like go to the village and go to the fish and chips joint, which is fish and fried potatoes, like our hamburgers were.
You move on to Southampton, and you get your first experience with an air raid at Southampton before you've even crossed over the English Channel. Talk about that.
That's right. We were in a staging area at Southampton where everyone was getting ready to go across the channel to France for the invasion. Of course, we didn't know where we were going or when. So one night, about midnight, I had an air raid there, and the bombs were falling so thick that barracks were kind of jumping up and down, and mess kits were falling off the walls and all, and officer stuck his head in the barracks and said, "Grab your helmets and hit the woods." So we didn't have to be told twice. We went out, and I laid down by a log I found, and I looked up. The whole camp was just lit as bright as day from the German flares that they had dropped in. The bombs were falling, and searchlights were showing on all the German planes going over. And finally I heard a loud plop close to me, I guess about 25 yards away or something. And we had heard talk about the forced labor from the inmate camps were sabotaging some of the munitions. And this happened to be a dud.
So that one got sabotaged, and that was good for you.
Yeah, it was a dud and didn't explode.
VE Day is June the 6th, 1944. 10 days later, on the 16th, is the day that your unit moves out across the English Channel and you land at Normandy, D-Day plus 10. Talk a little bit about landing at Omaha Beach.
Well, that's right. We were on a landing craft that was shuttling back and forth as fast as they could, taking troops across and then bringing the dead ones back from Normandy Beach. And I noticed a pile of bloody blankets over on one side, and I thought, well, looks like it might get a little serious here.
Yes, sir.
So we finally dropped the tailgate on this landing craft and drove our vehicles off into about 3 foot of water out on the beach.
You spend the first night at a briar patch, I think you said.
Yeah.
And but they're still shelling the beach, the harbor there.
They were. Shells were falling.
Even 10 days after D-Day.
Right.
But you and your job in your unit, you're working your way through the area, through northern France. Talk about what you were doing. You were climbing telephone poles and setting up communication.
At that time, we didn't have time to climb any poles or do any construction. It was mainly getting wiring to the front because the front was moving so fast.
Right.
And at one point, some of our unit, well, it wasn't our unit, but the Army had been pinned down, and they called in air support, and we was right at the edge of this. I could look down and see the planes coming in, and they had wrong directions, and they bombed our troops. Mm-hmm. And has been pretty well publicized to all the people that were killed there in friendly fire.
Communications to the front lines, though, this is your main job, and you get into the winter of 1944, and it becomes an even harder job because you're trying to negotiate poles in the dead of winter through a lot of snow and a lot of ice. That's a little different than your training, right?
Well, that's true, but before that we put communications all through the hedgerows, right, and everything, and then made a mad dash to Paris to follow Patton when he broke through, and of course they needed communications along the front as fast as it moved.
Right.
And we got to Paris with good reception, with people all along the route cheering us on, because we were among the first ones to get to Paris. And there we bivouacked just outside of Paris, and one man came to the camp and asked Buddy and I to come to his house to take a bath, mm-hmm, because we hadn't had one in a couple of months, I guess. And so the way we could wash it was just a little cold water and a helmet. And so we went with him, and he could, the trouble was, he could speak only French and Spanish, and I could speak only English and German. Mm-hmm. But we got along real well, and he gave us some breakfast and all.
We need to move along a little bit, but I know that the Battle of the Bulge was one of the Bronze Stars that you won was for your involvement in the Battle of the Bulge, so you were involved there. I want to come back and talk about that, but let's move along to after VE Day. The war is over in Europe, and you and your unit come across the concentration camp at Buchenwald. This is obviously something, an experience that you will never forget. And talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to show some photographs.
All right. After the war was practically over, they sent us to far east Germany at Weimar. And there, as we approached the area, we saw the smoke rising and everything. Of course, didn't know exactly what it was at that time. But we got settled in, and in a couple of days, we went up to this camp. It proved to be the Buchenwald concentration camp. Mm-hmm. And there we, as we went up to the camp along this tree-lined lane, there were bodies all along the way, and people that had, when the Germans evacuated the place, all the inmates that were there tried to run, and a lot of them were so weak they didn't make it. They died on the way. Right.
Let's show some, I want to make sure I get to these photographs, and you got some incredible photographs. So we're going to go all the way back to D+10 when you all landed at Normandy, and if you can see over there on that monitor, there's a photograph. That's a vehicle, I guess, similar to the one that you landed at Omaha Beach. Is that right?
Yes, that was, of course, we had a line truck. It was similar to some of these, but that's the way we drove off into the water and got out on the beach.
So this photograph is just taken of the typical landing that you were involved in.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Talk a little bit more about the Battle of the Bulge and your involvement in that. You were more on the eastern part of France, is that right?
We had worked our way into Belgium, mm-hmm, and all the way to Normandy, and had done a lot of communication work around there, telephone poles and all that stuff. When all of a sudden we had to get on our trucks and run like the dickens because the Germans had launched this Battle of the Bulge. With all the tanks that were coming, we had to try to outrun them, which we did, all the way back to Charleroi. And there we went to work immediately to put a communications across the Meuse River because the tanks were getting close to the river, and if they had, they'd have cut all of our communications. And it was the Christmas of 1943, and it's supposed to have been the coldest winter in the century, and I guess it was below
Indeed
zero.
It was. The weather wasn't very good. Matter of fact, we're going to go to a photograph now. This is soon after you landed at Normandy. You're not in this picture. This is a picture of a couple of your buddies, but that's sort of an example of how you lived there after the landing at Normandy.
That's typical of our tents. We called it a shelter half. Each one was issued half of a shelter. We had to put it together and usually dug a foxhole and then put this shelter over it, and it seemed like it rained every day there, and the water ran in on our blankets and got it all wet. It was miserable.
Yeah, some people learned how to smile, even though with that, because that was the job that you had to do. Going through Germany, you saw a lot of horror of the war, a lot of the remnants of the war, right. I know. And in a few seconds, we're going to go to one of the photographs that you had of sort of the bombed out part of Germany that I want you to talk about. And there it is right there. Talk about that picture and what we're looking at.
Well, all the this is us trying to repair a rail line, but most of the villages and towns were completely destroyed, and hardly knew where we were because we were all alike. They were all destroyed, and so bad that we had to bulldoze out the streets to even get through. This is only one of the examples of destroyed.
You have several pictures
villages
like this, and that's one of the pictures. There was a story about an airplane. I believe it was a German airplane. It was actually a jet airplane, and y'all weren't really familiar with planes without propellers. And talk a little bit. There was one that had crashed, and we're going to have a picture coming up of it here in just a little bit. And this was quite remarkable to the American soldier, looking at this plane without propellers.
Well, of course, this was it when we were in East Germany already, and the war was about over. And this plane crash landed in the pasture close to us, and we all went to see it because it was a plane without propellers, and we couldn't understand that. We'd never seen a jet plane.
See the soldier there on the right side taking a picture of this remarkable thing that they'd never seen before.
This German pilot had crash landed his plane there to keep from being captured by the Russians, and supposedly it brought his family with him. Of course, I didn't see the occupants of the plane, but this was the plane, the first jet plane.
Sonny, Buchenwald is still something that's obviously stamped in your memory. I guess before you got there, you did not realize the type of inhumanity that was involved in World War II, but this is something that you saw firsthand. It's something that I know that you'll never forget.
Well, that's right. I was actually, I think, the first person into the camp because I was sergeant that led the group into the camp when we got there, and no one else had been there. And I have some of the pictures here that we saw, and there was one person left in there that could speak very well and showed me around the camp and told us what had transpired in the camp and all.
Some of those photographs that I've seen, I've chosen not to show them on this particular program because they are quite graphic, but I know that people have probably seen histories of World War II. I do want to show a couple of things that you brought back from Buchenwald, and I want you to talk about them as I'm holding them here. Talk about, obviously, the swastika button Talk about the history of that and how you came by that.
Well, I just found that in the barracks next to the concentration camp. I just picked that up. It doesn't signify anything really.
Wonder, is it a collar ornament of some sort? I wonder if it's.
I think that's what it was. Yeah.
And the wings, I think you can see at the bottom of the wings, the swastika on that. This is made out of tin or aluminum.
German pilot. But as to these pictures, I've shown them to a lot of the schools and everything, so I don't imagine it being anything wrong with showing them now.
Right. Well, we're sort of pressed for time, but there is one thing that I wanted to show here, and I'm going to hold it up here to the cameras, and we will get a shot of it here when we get focused on it. And what this is a meal token that was actually given to you by an inmate of Buchenwald.
Right.
This is an incredible artifact of World War II. Talk a little bit about how you came about this and exactly what this is.
Well, he gave me this, and that was his meal token, which was given to the inmates for a hard day's work, and then entitled them to a little bowl of soup and probably a few potato peelings, which they fought over. But they literally all starved to death.
Indeed. This is an artifact. There's not many of those around, and you have one of them. After the war was over, you at the time you had orders to go and be involved in a ground war in Japan, but fortunately you didn't have to do that.
Well, of course, we had after the war was over, there was this numbers that accumulated, you know, where you were supposed to be able to go home, be discharged. But I was declared essential, or whatever you call it, and was given a command to go direct to Japan when the war was over. So we left Germany and into France with those instructions, and got on a train, French train, and went to Marseille, France, to get on a boat to go direct to the Pacific.
Sonny, we're out of time. I'm sorry, it just goes too quickly, and I apologize for that, but thank you very much for your service. Sonny Franze, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Just a farm boy from around Kurten, Sonny Franze saw a slice of life and death that few of us of our later generations would ever experience. An American soldier fighting on the native soil of his ancestors. He's certainly proud of his German heritage and equally proud to have fought and to live in a country that allows him to be. We salute Sergeant R.F. Sonny Franze and all veterans. And thanks to our underwriter, First National Bank. I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.